Hey everyone, welcome to Time Sensitive. This week, Spencer's in conversation with the architect Brad Cloepfil, who's the principal of the Portland and New York-based firm Allied Works Architecture. Brad's projects include the Clifford Still Museum in Denver, the Museum of Arts and Design in New York, and the National Veterans Memorial and Museum in Columbus, Ohio. What'd you guys talk about?
We get deep into his views on this blurred relationship between art and architecture. It's a very Slowdown episode. Really, our conversation makes clear how and why he's really got this sharp perspective, not only because he's designed all these museums, including, as you mentioned, the Clifford Still. It's just because it's really who he is. It's his life story. I mean, he views what he does as a calling. We talked at length about his first commission, the Widened and Kennedy headquarters in Portland, Oregon, and why all of his buildings he views in some level as a chapel.
That, for sure, was such an extraordinary building.
Changed a lot of how people view the office and the
creative spaces.
Yeah, exactly. The commons. There's also a reverence to the craft of architecture that Brad brings to the table. He talks about it in terms of a form of listening, not just to clients, but to a site, to his own internal artistic and architectural rumblings. For him, it's a form of writing, of poetry, of creating language, and also through all of that, finding this profound sense of the ethereal.
Which all his work has.
Exactly.
I'm excited about this. Before we get into it, we'd first like to thank our Season 5 sponsor, L'École School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. Through its courses, talks, exhibitions, and publications, as well as its extensive research program, L'École sits at the intersection of art, gemology, and craftsmanship. Founded in 2012, it explores and showcases jewelry in all aspects, contributing to and consolidating knowledge around the world of jewelry.
From prehistoric to contemporary jewelry, from men's jewelry to tribal designs, from rare gems to goldsmithing techniques, L'École covers a wide range of topics and approaches. Making jewelry knowledge more accessible to all, L'École allows the public to learn about things such as the no longer existing jewelry house La Cloche, 20th century female jewelers, and the impeccable work of the artist, jewelry maker, and metalsmith Daniel Brush.
Opening up a territory that has long remained largely unknown and compartmentalized, the jewelry arts, L'École brings an incredible level of knowledge and rigor to all that it does. It even has a scientific council made up of experts from the realms of academia, museums, and science. This group helps ensure that its various programs, exhibitions, and projects have a consistently high level of quality. You can find out more about L'École at www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. And now, here's Spencer and Brad.
Hi, Brad. Welcome to Time Sensitive.
It's great to be here, Spencer.
Let's begin today with a subject we have sort of discussed before, but not quite like this, Dan Wieden. This may seem random to those listening, but just bear with me for a moment. For those who don't know, Dan was the co-founder of the advertising agency Wieden & Kennedy, which is famous for the Just Do It tagline and its work with Nike. And Dan was your first big major client, Brad. A $30 million project, Wieden & Kennedy's Portland, Oregon headquarters. On September 30th at age 77, Dan recently passed away. His obit ran in the New York Times at the end of last week. So I wanted to ask first, how are you thinking about Dan, his legacy, his life, his death, his impact on your life? He changed your life forever. I mean, you've previously said, I owe my career to Dan Wieden.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. It's heartbreaking because he was young by today's standard. And when you know a mind like that is just so expansive and fast and funny, and to watch it slowly diminish and fade away to nothing, it is just completely heartbreaking. He had this uncommon ability to see talent. I remember the woman who who invented or created the campaign. The first women's sports campaign, I think, was called If You Let Me Play. I don't know if you remember that. She was a receptionist at Widened Kennedy. And he took her and kept putting her in positions and challenging her. And she made one of the most important sports campaigns ever for women. So he just had this incredible judgment, and then also just the support to draw people out. I mean, it was absolutely insane that he hired me with my two, ex-University of Oregon students to do a building when I had.
And we'll get to that moment in your career and that legacy. But I did want to touch on the process of working with him. When you and I spoke almost a decade ago, you told me that he was a, quote, really good architecture critic. And it seems to me that, especially when you're an architect working on the kinds of projects you work on and at the level you work on, a building is only as good as its client. Of course, it's only as good as its architect too, but the client is like a sparring partner.
Right. Well, yeah, it's, for me in particular, it's such a process of exploring and investigation and testing. And it must have been a process that he was used to, because he just instantly joined the conversation. He'd never built a building or a house or anything. So it was his first project. And I think he was extra excited because of that. But he just became a part of the conversation so quickly and readily, and then just had the innate ability to ask the occasional question that I couldn't answer. So I knew that he was right and I was wrong, that kind of thing. Should the railing really be there? Well, no, now that you mention it, I guess it's really a huge mistake. So there was various things like that with him where he would just kind of see things. It just, I guess, in a world of ideas, when you've just been in a world of ideas for so long, that you can shift frames of reference and still just be right in it, just in the flow of it.
This project arguably helped lead to a global shift in office design. I mean, more open, more social, more communal. I'm not saying it was the only project that did that, but it certainly contributed. There's an amphitheater component to the design, a step seat that has become practically ubiquitous in offices today. And I'm sure the learnings from this project no doubt influenced and impacted the designs for other offices you did later on for Pixar, Uniqlo, Theory. How do you think about this impact in your own work and also at large in the world? Like, what legacy do you think this project in particular has?
Well, I think the thing that made or still makes Widened Kennedy's headquarters unique is that it was, the very intent of it was to create civic space. It was, well, there was two intents. One, he wanted to make a factory for ideas rather than office space. And then he wanted to make a collective room where 450 people in the agency could all come together. As the building was being built and nearly finished, I sat in the middle of the atrium space, in the amphitheater space with Dan. And I said, Dan, this space is a lot bigger than the agency. This is a space that everyone in the city of Portland will want to use. And it ended up being true. It ended up being one of the most important rooms in the city of Portland. And just that intent that he imbued that project with, to create that kind of collective place where he could bring in music and speakers and everything, and then it kind of generated beyond itself. So I think that idea of turning a private office inside out is really what that project did. And I think that's the resonance of it right there, is you could create offices as cities and squares.
It's also this very decidedly ethereal space. I mean, there's something almost sacred about the environment you've created there. It's like the cathedral that Nike built, Do you see it that way? And more generally, like, how do you think about this notion of sacred space?
No, you just went right into it, didn't you? Not even much warm up here. So in that particular project, and probably coincidentally, in all of the subsequent projects. Part of the goal, part of the mission, part of the charge was to create inspiring space. Inspire people to question, to think, to come together, to just want to be there and make work. So I think that presence, it's really interesting. I toured a group of Portland leadership through there when it was built, because it got a lot of attention. And one of them was a Presbyterian minister, and he said the exact same. He said, this place is a chapel. I know we'll come back to this too, where I think all of the spaces I've designed have been chapels to a certain extent. If you assign the qualities of taking you out of the day-to-day, taking you out of the common into other realms of kind of mystery and wonder, if you experience light in ways you haven't experienced it, if you experience space in ways you haven't experienced, it kind of sets your day apart and gives you that sense of being somewhere special, I guess, right? And isn't that what architecture is supposed to do? I mean, I think that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to distinguish a there.
I should come in here and say that prior to today's conversation, you sent over some unpublished writings from a book of reflective essays that you're working on. And in one of them, you note that when a space creates time, when it affords distance yet offers endless depth, it approaches the sacred, adding that perhaps the most sacred of spatial experiences is awe. Could you elaborate on this awe? How does a building create awe?
How does a building create awe? I kind of tie awe and wonder together too. I think very hard to define, very, very hard. It's more of a quest than something one achieves, I think. But I think when a building truly locates you in the world, when you think of the most important spaces you've been, whether it's in the landscape or the built realm, right? Unbuilt or the built realm. Those are the places that you stop. And then when you stop, you hear things, you see things, you recognize relationships, right? You become a part of a different conversation. I guess you could say it's a conversation of the present as much as anything else. And I think when you walk into profound spaces, and it doesn't have to be associated with scale. It doesn't have to be, monumental, although that I think we associate that with awe a lot of times. But when you walk into profound spaces, and sometimes profoundly intimate spaces, Clifford Still Museum, which is an intensely intimate space, when you walk into those spaces that really cause you to pause and kind of set things down, right? I feel like we just carry so much all the time, right? We are sort of stuffing all of our pockets and holding on to things as hard as we can and rushing about. And then when you really stop and set things down, I mean, I know I've experienced this. I'm sure you have too. There's a sense of expansion. And I think certain rooms, certain spaces offer that.
There's this story you have about Notre Dame, which you went to when you were young. I was hoping you might share that here.
Yeah, that was amazing. That'll never happen again because it's well, first of all, yeah, the tragedy, but then also just the numbers. Yeah, I think it was a winter day and I walked in there for the first time. I mean, a winter's evening, and I walked in for the first time. And first there was silence and there was like 12 people in it. I don't know. Can you imagine? It's incredible. And then they started practicing the choir, and it was transcendent. It was like there was no source of sound. It was solid. It was like visceral, solid sound in space as one thing. And then it was dark. I mean, it was not lit well then. It wasn't like everything is today, all display. There were places of great mystery up there that you couldn't really see. And yeah, it was unbelievably moving. Yeah. Those are the spaces. I mean, if you think of the things you remember too, one of the things that architecture can do, unlike many of the other arts that we produce. It can create these places of profound memory. And we do have them in landscape, and we have it in performance art. You remember certain performances, and obviously relationships with visual arts, right? But architecture can place you in a space in the world that you'll just remember for the rest of your life. It's like a moment. I mean, that's what keeps me.
Beyond the Notre Dame experience, are there any others from across time that you recall having that sort of stop you in your tracks, visceral, awe-inspiring response to?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting when I saw Ronchamp late in life and studying it, and just almost like I can't hear about it anymore. If I see another photo, it's just it can't be that good, right? It just can't possibly be that good. And lo and behold, it was unbelievable. Probably one of the most perfect sacred spaces I've ever been in. But then there's other simple ones.
Yeah, I had that experience at Eileen Gray's E1027. Tiny little house on the coast of France, but just extraordinary in its ability to make you stop and feel.
Right. Isn't it? It's so nice. And I guess, we get numb to things when we see too many images of them too. I think that's part of the things.
Instagram.
Right. Yeah, even worse. Right. Even now, just beat us to death. There's a quote from Pico Iyer that I have somewhere in my files that says something about it. By the end of the 20th century, people saw more images in a day than the Victorian era saw in a lifetime. I think that's a profound statement about how we become numb to a kind of in a sensory way, or how hard it is to see, how hard it is to really see when we just get bombarded with things, disembodied things. Yeah, disembodiment also is interesting.
Well, I want to pause here on the subject of time. In that same essay I quoted from earlier, you write, "At the most elemental and most aspirational, my work is to create space, and perhaps equally important, to create time. Buildings make time with others, art and music, and yourself, time to celebrate, work collectively, and think alone, to both lose oneself and ideally find orientation." And this orientation idea, which obviously is sort of the antithesis of the disembodiment you were just alluding to,
Right.
I'd love for you to riff on this a bit. Give me the Brad Cloepfil Time 101 tutorial.
Time 101 tutorial. Well, I think the way in for me, there's so many ways in, but the idea of locating you, I think that's the offering. That Per Peterson quote from Out Stealing Horses that says, "I've lived many places, now I am here." And that was one of the most profound statements I've ever read. How many of us actually can say that? Now I am here, and have that experience in a visceral, meaningful way. So I think when rooms offer you that, or help you establish a position in the world, you can't really see unless you have a position, can you? Right? Unless you know where you are, and again, metaphorical in so many ways, right? Unless you know where you are, how can you establish any kind of relative sense of things and sort of measure and prospect and all of those worlds? And I think rooms that are tuned, that are really crafted and tuned thoughtfully, can offer you that sense of position.
Ram Dass, be here now, but make it architecture.
Yeah. That's what architecture does. That's what it has the ability to do, I guess. It doesn't do it that often, frankly, but it can. I think.
Well, there's this quality of slowness in your work and your architectural approach that I wanted to mention. The notion of standing still, pausing, listening.
Mm-hmm.
These are central components to your process and how you work. And I was hoping you might share a bit about your sort of philosophical thinking around this idea of slow, tactile listening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've used listening in so many different ways. But I think, you can listen with your eyes. As an architect, as somebody involved in a practice of visual industry, the production of visual inquiry, I listen with my eyes. You listen with your eyes when you go visit a site, whether it's a city or a landscape. Sometimes I feel when I walk onto a site for the first time, I feel like my eyes are like half of my body, because I'm just trying to see as much as I can possibly see, and see in every way possible, notationally, relationally, try to find a presence there. So it's almost like seeing with your skin too, right? What is that presence?
Johanni Palasma.
Is that right?
Eyes of the Skin, this brilliant book.
Oh, that's fantastic.
All about it.
Oh, really? That's so fantastic. Yeah, he's a good writer too. Then there's the seeing that's relative to producing drawings. I sent you that one Jane Hirschfield poem where at the end, I could read the whole poem, but at the end, I take the pencil to my ear and I listen. And that's drawing. That's drawing. Drawing is a form of listening.
Makes me think of the Seamus Heaney poem, Digging. And he's talking about a pen and he says, the squat pen rest, I'll dig with it.
That's so good, because I was, in some of the other writing for this series of essays, I talk about the production of architecture as an agricultural act, that you're really raising things up. You're cultivating and raising things up in the way you draw and the way you visualize things. You're trying to bring latent things forth, just like seeds in the ground, right?
Writing is also something I want to bring up, because you talk a lot about this poetic idea of a calling. And there's this distinctive rottenness to your buildings. That's partly, I think, a result of the fact that you actually take the time to write, and not just with materials, but with words. Could you talk about the time you've spent searching and crafting the language to describe your concepts and buildings? And how has that in turn shaped the very structures themselves? Like, where do you see this link between writing and building?
Wow, that's something I've never talked about. I came to the writing later as a necessity. I think the first writing class I ever took was an undergrad. And I wrote a short story about someone in a room listening to the sound of the ocean and what that did to compress memory and time. And that professor sent it in for a prize, which of course I didn't win, or my career might have taken a different path. But so I came to writing late. I didn't have, I never had any practice.
Well, undergrad, that's still pretty early, but
yeah, I guess so. But then once you start designing buildings, you're trying to present, when you present your ideas, and especially the work that I do and we do at Allied Works, the pursuit is the experience and the space. The form and the image is a resultant, that comes out of that pursuit. And so when you're talking to clients or you're giving lectures about the work and you're trying to explain what it is, that's where I came to writing.
Architects aren't known for their writing chops.
Well, I think I also came to it because as I got older, I read more and more poetry. I read a lot of poetry now. And I think it's really no different than early in my career. I think the reason I ended up doing so many, art museums and working in the visual realm like that was because I was drawn to paintings and installations and sculpture because they could do things that I wanted to do. I could see the ideas. They were there in their work. So they were like mentors. They were like, they were models and mentors of things that I wanted to try to do in architecture, and yet they did it in painting or sculpture or whatever. So I think as I sort of mined the visual arts to help find the work and to use as kind of checkpoints and signposts along the way, I started doing the same thing with writing. It was basically just that search to try to find, you find a poem and you just go, that's it, that ephemeral thing that we're all looking for. And then you realize, when in the very first book, Occupation, when I was talking to all these other disciplines and individuals as part of that book, I was talking to Doug Aitken and Ann Hamilton and all these people. And then I realized we're all pursuing the same things. I mean, the processes are not that different. The series of ideas come out of this cultural moment in time. And so it's like this shared conversation. And I'm sure it's exactly the same with the poets and writers. I think the writing came, to get back to your question, the craft of it came out of me trying and still trying today to use words to evoke the possibilities of architecture, to try to join up with it. And that's the essay book that I've been working on for the last couple of years, is just that, to kind of get it all down, the pursuit of it. It means a lot to me because, I enjoy it, but it means a lot because it's not like I'm writing to write. I'm writing to help try to evoke this ineffable thing that we're all trying to find.
Let's go back in time to your upbringing. You grew up in Portland, and you've described your childhood as idyllic and kind of a fantasy life. What was the house that you grew up in like? And also, do you think this, either your family's house or the neighborhood, was on some level a place of fostering your interest in the built environment?
Yeah, I grew up in, very normative lower middle class neighborhood in Portland, which was lovely. It still had open fields and woodlots, and it was the suburban fantasy, which lasted about 10 years, I think, in American culture, right? And they got crushed by development. But, I was just free. I left the house every day and came home for dinner. That was it. And just explored. So the house was very simple. Very nice 2-story, 1920s house. But it was really the landscape. I got to make forts in the forest and lose myself in meadows of grass that were like over my head. And, it was just a profound sense of place. It's also where I became really interested in plants and botany, and I wanted to be an ornithologist. It was really that sense of place and nature. I still know every flower, every tree, every bird song. What a sense of location. I was thinking about that the other day. When I go, I visited my daughter in Virginia last spring, and it was so fantastic to wake up, just during migration, perfect time, and to hear birdsong that I didn't know. I could tell I was in a place I don't know this place. I don't know the trees, I don't know the flowers, and I don't know the bird song. So it's an amazing sense of location when those things kind of stitch you to a place, right? The things that you recognize. And I guess not everyone pays attention to that.
Well, it's interesting. It gets me thinking about the musician Andrew Bird, who's done a series of albums based on echolocation. So it's sort of this call and response he does in these environments with his violin. So a canyon, a meadow. And I think what you do as an architect's not all that different. It's the pause, it's the waiting, it's the listening, it's the response.
I love that idea of echolocation.
Well, so you go on to study at the University of Oregon, even though, as you've said previously, you had no idea really what architecture was. I mean, your older brother had at some point started studying it and introduced you to the possibility of it, but you'd always wanted to be an artist. Could you share a bit about your early engagement in art, and what were you making? How did that then translate into your architectural training?
Mm-hmm. I just think I was visual. I'm just a visual thinker from the beginning, from the very, very beginning. I mean, very early on, because I did want to be a botanist, I did botanical drawings, checked out whatever books, cutting sections through flowers, all of those things. So there was that visualization. Also, I was really fortunate. My mother worked for a newspaper, and she would bring newsprint, the leftover newsprints, whatever they are, the centers that never got used. And I would roll these rolls of newsprint in the hallway up in the second floor bedroom and could just make these fantasy murals. They're probably horrible, but I wish I could see one today. Because I could just draw cities and towns and things. And it was so much fun. And so I think just because I was a visual explorer, I didn't know what art was any more than I knew what architecture was. I just loved to draw. And then, as I've mentioned before, I just didn't have the courage to tell my parents I was going to be an artist, but I thought I could get away with architecture. So that's what I did. And I think the inquiry, that sense of adventure, the sense of pursuing wonder, whether it's in the fields and woodlots, whether it's in more powerful landscapes in the Columbia Gorge or the high desert, right? Or with a pencil and a roll of newsprint, that pursuit of wonder, I think, was in me. And whether I had gone into, the visual arts or architecture, it just became a form of practice.
And you and your brother were the first in your family to go to college.
That's right. Yeah. It was hard when it's such a big deal to your family. And that's why I felt like some responsibility for what I was studying to have some sense of return. Although the artists I know today are so much more successful than I clearly made the wrong choice of career as far as that goes. Yeah, I think I'm the only one to have a graduate degree in my family.
Yeah. So after Oregon, you head to Columbia University for your master's. But before you do, you spent a summer building homes on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation in Montana.
That was wild. Yeah.
What was that experience like? I mean, what did you learn there? And must have been really formative, I imagine.
Yeah. The landscape is so amazing because it was out in Browning. That's the reservation headquarters in Browning. And then living in Cutbank, a town just east of there, it's the prairie, which is now, mostly wheat fields and things, but in the American prairie. So that sense of space and scale, not like the Pacific Northwest, where the landscape is so intimate, was amazing. But really working on the reservation, the most profound thing or the most memorable thing was just the friends I met. There was a group of 3 or 4 architects, but I hung out with guys from the tribe. I played on the reservation softball team. I drove 40 miles to drink in a tavern and then another 35 miles to drink in another tavern with a 12-pack of beer on the roof of my car. I mean, that's what one did in the reservation. So it was a very interesting, I think, for me, cultural awareness. I mean, just the reservation life, the kind of brutality of reservation life. People that had gotten scholarships to go play basketball at Montana State or Montana and quit after the second year and came back to the reservation.
And what were you building? I mean, these houses were kind of...
Yeah, there was a Blackfoot architect, and so he got these contracts to build reservation housing, and we would work with. There was you develop a series of different components and things, right? And you sit with a family, And it's still interesting that, it was the Blackfeet in particular, too, were a very nomadic culture. And so, you're giving them a kind of kit of parts to select from. And then in the end, half of their things are outside, their cars are right up to the front of their house. There's sort of no sense of boundary in the dwelling because it just was never a part of their culture. At least in my experience there, they didn't have the same value for that sense of inside and out and a here and a there because it's all there to them. It's interesting, we're about to start a U.S. Embassy project in Mongolia and Ulaanbaatar, in another nomadic culture that if it basically hadn't been colonized by the Chinese and the Russians, I can't even imagine there'd be much building. So what does one build? I mean, to go back to Montana again and build in that landscape, boy, I would love the opportunity. How do you capture a piece of the Great Plains with a sense of boundary and location? And how does one create a there? So I wish we were able to ask those questions then in a government housing program for a native reservation. It wasn't going to happen, but it was a really interesting time, amazing time.
Hey everyone, taking a quick break here to tell you a little bit about our Season 6 sponsor, L'École School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. In addition to exhibitions, publications, research projects, and public events, L'École offers a range of courses led by experts across jewelry, craft, history, and the arts. Celebrating its first decade this year, L'École, which has permanent campuses in both Paris and Hong Kong, plans to open a third space in Shanghai next year, and will soon open another in Paris, which will feature a public library of more than 7,000 reference works on jewelry and gems. At its main Paris space, L'École is also opening a gemothèque, or gem library, that contains some 1,200 stones for visitors to view and even handle. This year, they'll also be presenting 6 exhibitions in Hong Kong, Tokyo, and Paris, and publishing 8 books. You can learn more about L'École and its current and upcoming offerings at www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. And now, back to the episode. So you graduate Columbia 1985. You go to work at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill in Los Angeles, and then on to Switzerland, where you worked for the architect Mario Botta. Tell me about your time in Botta's studio. And I'm asking this specifically because you've previously mentioned how his work, as well as the work of Tadao Ando, had this really profound impact on you when you were coming up in the field.
Well, it's because Ken Frampton wrote the foreword to 2 books, 2 Electa editions, little square black and white books. I guess, weren't they Italian? I think they were. Basically for students. And when I was working as an architect in Alaska for a few months, I met these kids from Harvard who had these books. And I couldn't believe the work. It was so beautiful. Mario Botta's early houses, before he got so stylized. And I mean, I just fell in love with the work. I'd never seen work so specific to place, so about structure, and, with my university education with the folks that had come from Kahn's office. So that language, to see it new, applied to different cultures and places, but the legacy of that thinking was the first time I'd ever seen it. So I was inspired, and I was afraid to go to Japan. But when my girlfriend, who later became my first wife, got out of law school, she said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to go to Switzerland and work for Mario Botta. So, and I think one of the great takeaways was, Switzerland made up a lot of small towns, very small towns. And you'd see these beautiful pieces of architecture ones that weren't at that time even in that book so much, by Livio Vecchini and Luigi Snozzi and, a lot of regional architects living in these small villages doing these exquisite little houses.
Hyper local.
Yeah. Or you'd see a garage. At that time, you would see a garage in Switzerland that you would never see a piece of architecture that good in all of the United States. I mean, there was such a rich culture. And that's what inspired me to think maybe someday I could, go to Portland, Oregon and try to do this. Because if they can do it in these little mountain villages, even with the history and culture, obviously, but if you could do that, there might be a way.
Well, if there's anything that the Pacific Northwest shares Switzerland, I would say it's craft tradition.
Right.
Woodworking.
Yep. That has a huge impact on that. I mean, the two big impacts on my work, the two things that influence the making, I guess, one, the legacy of Kahn's teachings, and then the craftsmanship of the Pacific Northwest, a kind of deep love of making beautiful things and spending the time to render detail. I love the realization. It was probably 10 years into my career where I really understood the difference between your eye and your hand. Kind of perceiving a piece of architecture, again, whether it's your eye or your skin, right? And then finding your scale in it, which is really your hand. We talk about that in the office. Like, where's the hand? Where's the place where I finally recognize how big I am relative to this whole space or landscape or city or whatever it is? And that's where detail comes in. Without that, you're placeless. I mean, without that, you can't find your measure. And sometimes that sense of being lost is good. Back to the wonder and awe, right? Where you're. But I think without any reference of where you are from a scale point, I think it's a lot harder to go on that journey, because otherwise it's just disorienting, which we encounter a lot, don't we, in buildings and cities.
Let's go back to Kahn for a second. For the listeners who don't know, Louis Kahn, could you talk about what about his philosophies, his thinking so captured or enraptured you?
Right. He talked about the will of buildings, the will of a material, that material and structure has a presence and a being. He was a deeply spiritual thinker.
He talked to materials. There's the book, You Say to Brick.
Right. Yeah, I asked the brick, what does it want to be? And it said an arch or something, badly paraphrased. But, in the late 70s, mid-70s, when I was at the University of Oregon, is when he passed away, and about 6 or 7 of his students and employees came and basically took over the University of Oregon. And I was lucky enough to be going to the only state program of architecture at that time. So I had this incredible design education and structures education. Just being presented with the poetic possibilities of building, which still is rarely discussed. Then was rarely discussed, now is rarely discussed. And that the poetic possibilities of structure. I mean, I always think of structure as it's the paint of the painting. It's what we have as architects. That's what makes architecture distinct, is structure. How the building is made, what places it in the world, how it stands in the world is the primary means of communication that we have. And that all comes from. And it's interesting, why did Ken Frampton choose Mario Botta and Tadao Ando to write about in the very beginning? Because it was part of that legacy, but applied in these intensely regional, local ways, right?
So you returned to Portland. You found Allied Works in 1994, eventually get a small commission to design 2 handicap accessible bathrooms and a bar for $2,000 plus a bar tab.
Right, exactly.
What happened next?
Critical. Well, it was rough, right? I mean, like every young architect, there were some house additions and things like that. But this loops back to, well, there's two things. And I can't remember what came first. I think, well, first, my first art commission was for Jane Beebe, a tiny little art gallery for her. And I designed a single room with no corners, where the corners were doors, and it was thinking of Soane's house a little bit, thinking of a kind of, was it a early
Sir John Soane,
yes,
amazing house,
right? And then also it was either Mary Miss or Alice Aycock, early piece that was just a series of doors. Mine was to make the room feel bigger than it was, and also it was a gallery by appointment, so Jane could open the doors and show art on either side because it was such a tiny room. So it was a way of expanding the room. But anyway, that was my first, I still love that project, actually. That was my first art space. And then about that time is when I met Christy Edmonds, who was starting something called the Portland Institute of Contemporary Art. And Christy is now the director.
Mass Mocha.
She's the director of Mass Mocha. I'm going up there tomorrow to see her, by the way. But she was just starting that, and so I really wanted to meet her. And then it was about that time. Oh, back to the bar. Gosh, it's all weaving together. I haven't thought about this in so long. So I got a call from one of the partners at Widened Kennedy, who was sitting at the bar that I did for $2,000.
And a bar tab.
Yeah, and a bar tab, which was critical. With my two employees. I think one of them was only part-time then, so like 1.5 place. And I got a phone call from a partner at Widened Kennedy saying, I got your number from the bartender at Saucebox. We are looking to do a new headquarters building and wondered if you want to talk about it. But we only want to see your contemporary work. As if I had, first of all, I don't know what work I had to show in general. I used to have one of those little message pieces of paper, message from. I used to have that somewhere. It's in a file maybe. But anyway, that's how the Widened and Kennedy process began. And one of the first meetings with them, it's actually how I got started in art space, because then we built a space for Pica in the Widened and Kennedy building. And that's kind of how the whole thing took off. But when first time I met with Widened and Kennedy and the partners and Susan Hoffman and others and John Jay, I took out a book I had on Donald Judd's studio at Marfa, and I passed around the book and I said, "Isn't this the space we all want to work in? We don't want to work in office space. We want to work in this space." And that's how I started the discussion with them.
And then over the past 3 decades, starting with the Mary Hill Overlook, you've built this incredible body of work. And I do want to hit most of the highlights in the time we have. So in the interest of keeping this conversation forward, I wanted to do a sort of project-to-project speed round.
Sure.
So just kind of tell me what immediately comes to mind for you when I mention each project. It can really be top of mind. You can go long, you can go short.
This is like a parlor game.
Yeah.
What's the first thing you associate with these projects?
So let's start with the Mary Hill Overlook.
Uh-huh. That was a project I made happen. And I'm starting to do this again, So
the Sightings Project.
Right. I wrote this thing when I came back to Portland after I left Columbia. I wanted to start my own practice. I was working for Tom Hacker, one of my mentors from University of Oregon / Philadelphia. And I really wanted to do my own work, but, I didn't have any. I was just working as an architect. And I wrote this position piece that it mattered where you built mattered to what you built, which to me seemed obvious. And it was a time... It's interesting. It's not that different than today. Different style of architecture, but it's still a time that is ruled by style and image. Architecture as commodity rather than architecture as thing. So I wrote this piece saying that, architecture begins with the site. And then I proposed 5 different sites, city, rural, suburban, forests, I can't even, desert.
Farmland.
Yeah. So I proposed 5 different sites and started developing drawings. And then I think, I was teaching the Sightings Project as a summer student at University of Oregon. I met the director of the Maryhill Museum, and we just hit off a conversation. And she let me do a show of the Sightings Project. Because we used her museum's grounds for one of the pieces, for the desert piece. So, and the students, I designed this whole installation, showed the student work, and then while I was talking to her, I said, how about if we build one? Right? How about if you let me design a sightings piece on the grounds of the Maryhill Museum? And she got her grant writers to get highway interpretive funds. I think it was $100,000. And we got to build that little Maryhill overlook piece.
Which is sort of Judd-like, actually.
Yeah, and it was, all I tried to do, that's hard. That's hard because obviously I'd seen the pieces there. But what I was trying to do was build a wall in an infinite landscape. And how does one begin to define location? By building a boundary. And it's a very harsh landscape, so concrete was an obvious choice. And also, the only people that would build it were highway overpass contractors. So concrete was their language as well. But that little ribbon, 150-foot long ribbon of concrete was a hollow wall where you could sort of find your place, find some form of reference in that landscape.
Okay, next one. We can keep this one brief. Well,
okay.
Maybe not. Contemporary Art Museum, St. Louis.
Wow, that was, first museum project. I owe that project to Terry Riley, my good friend who passed away not too long ago. He was curator of architecture at MoMA at the time, right? And Emmy Pulitzer came to him to do a short list, which there's some really funny stories about the interviews, but we don't have to go into that.
And I believe it's your first project outside of Portland.
Yeah. Our first project outside of Portland.
Also worth mentioning, it's next door to Tadao Ando's Pulitzer Arts Foundation,
right.
which
how
incredible
terrifying.
this architect who you studied, admired.
Yeah, it was terrifying. And I met him. Yeah, in 1 week I met Tadao Ando and Richard Serra. Talk about intimidating, young architect from Portland, Oregon.
And beating out Rem Koolhaas and Peter Zumthor for the commission.
Right, which I think Terry had something to do with talking Emmy Pulitzer out of that one. But, this is what I was told. I won that project because I compared the Ando building as a cupped hand facing the ground, closed. It's a cloister. It's that way. And that I wanted to create a building that was open, a cupped hand open to the sky. I think there's some core, illusion in that, but it wasn't intended as such at the time. But I wanted a building that was open. So it's interesting that, Ando creates such bounded form, and with those 2 ribbons of concrete, we created an open web.
Next one, Museum of Arts and Design in New York.
Wow. So I still contend they chose this young architect from Oregon because they knew how naive I was to walk into that controversy.
I mean, this project was tricky, beyond tricky.
Right.
Probably the trickiest of projects. Really like an impossibility for any architect.
Right. And I was so earnest and excited I took it on.
I would guess you would never imagine, though, that you'd have Tom Wolfe lambasting you in the New York Times for actually this sort of quote-unquote capital E ephemeralism.
Yeah.
Calling it a religion, basically. Architect Cloepfil, he called you, as if you were some dictator for this new architectural style of high taste.
Right. What's also interesting about that, my good friend David Shipley, whose apartment I'm staying in right now, was the head of the editorial page and let Tom Wolfe roast me 2 different times. And now we're good friends. I don't know how I let that one go. But
did you ever meet Tom in person?
No.
Oh.
I wish I could have, actually, because I love the way he dressed. Oh, my God.
Did he roast you both times for the Mad Museum?
Oh, yeah. He got to do it as a series. It was, once wasn't enough, apparently. No, I got it twice. The thing I'm most excited, two things most excited about that is that we didn't build anything. We created architecture by cutting a negative space into a solid inert object, the 2-foot slot. And that's how the light comes in and how the spaces are joined in section. And
Sculpting light.
yeah, that was it. Yeah, a ribbon of light. That's how we made that space. And then the cladding, the iridescent tiles were all about the play of light. So
The form's actually not all that different from Mary Hill Overlook in an interesting way.
the ribbon, yeah, that comes up. I mean, Frampton wrote about that. That ribbon, the Mary Hill Overlook, and then the Dutchess County Guest House. And I think the ribbon, that kind of sense of meander and labyrinth and the infinite, again, goes back to some of our discussions about awe and wonder and mystery.
Next one, University of Michigan Museum of Art.
Yeah, our first sort of proper museum project, I guess, and adjoining a neoclassical, really sweet little neoclassical memorial hall. You know, that was really a site piece as much as anything else. We were building on one of the most used paths from the student union through the historical heart of campus, the original 40. And so we, with a series of, steel and glass bents and limestone, walls sort of interlocking, we tried to just capture both light and the students. That as they move through this, kind of force them to move. Well, they literally move through the building in the winter, which is a big part of life in Michigan. You actually, the paths that are outside turn to paths inside through buildings. And just try to make them engage in the spatial quality of the building and make them engage in the art so it becomes a part. We built the building right on the ground, no piano nobile. There's an immediacy. It was all about immediacy of the art to the students.
I mean, you mentioned this idea of it being so potent as a site, and siting is so much a part of what you talk about when you talk about architecture. Again, in one of your unpublished essays, you write, by changing our definition of site from static property to a dynamic potential, we exponentially increase the possibilities and consequences of interaction. How'd you think about that site? And did you anticipate, for example, that the building would one day be wrapped by a jute sack installation by Ibrahim Mahama?
Oh, I love that piece so much. I've written about this and other things, that I suppose the highest aspiration of the art space we make is here's another way of saying it. If we manifest the qualities of sight, the presence and energy of a place, if we manifest some of that and kind of amplify qualities of that in a building, right? If the building becomes the amplifier of qualities of sight, then the greatest aspiration for me is that building then become a site for the art. And that is a perfect example.
This is such a good segue because I want to get to the Clyfford Still Museum.
Yeah.
And maybe here we have to slow down a bit and do a quick pause because this is an extraordinary project. And I don't use the word extraordinary when talking about architecture very often. I'll happily do so here. It's a building that captures, I think, everything we've been talking about in this conversation. I know that I'm not alone in thinking this. Everyone who visits has some sort of awe-inspiring response. The architect Robert McCarters called the museum a canonical masterwork. Shortly after it opened, the architecture critic John King tweeted that it's the best fusion of architecture and art I've encountered in a decade. Paul Goldberger responded to that tweet, writing that it's the best small museum in the U.S. in years. I mean, some high praise. And now that it's been a decade, and I know you answered this when we were in Denver earlier this year for that 10th anniversary panel discussion, but How are you thinking about this project in particular, its impact, not just on you, but on the city of Denver, on the legacy of Clifford Still, and grandiose as this may sound, the world of architecture?
Yeah, I don't know about that last one, but well, maybe I'll talk about how it happened a little bit. I got that project when we as an office had matured. We knew how to build what we considered, right? I was just getting to a point where I knew that my thinking and our ability to build were one. I'd been working with Chelsea Grassinger, Kyle Lohman, Dan Cook, people that for so long at that time, and I'm still working with them, right? Where we could kind of finish each other's thoughts and, where I could do my ambiguous charcoal sketches and they knew exactly what was present in them. And so I think that gift for me of having that relationship with people to develop it. Yeah, Brent Linden was on that. To develop that work with those people, it just, I could kind of go as far as I wanted to go. There was no longer any limits to what I thought we could do. And then I knew Still's work. I saw it at the Met when I was at Columbia. And so it was like it was like being asked to be a part of a conversation that I'd been a part of forever, and he grew up in the Dakotas and, did paintings of that landscape and the hoodoos in southern Alberta. And then he taught in the Palouse in Washington State. And so I think, he adamantly resists any figurative associations, but his early paintings were all landscapes. And a lot of the language in there, you see it go all the way through. So to me, it was just a visceral connection to the work at a time when I was most confident in the language of the architecture. And I just thought that was, when that came up, I just thought, if ever there was a commission for us and me, that would be it.
And there's this great story you tell. So yes, you're advanced, you have the team in place, your work has matured to a point enough that you're able to get that kind of commission. But you've told this great story to me about how about a month before it opened, you walked in and the paintings weren't on the walls yet, but the building was ostensibly done. And your heart sank. And I'm hoping you might just explain what happened.
Yeah. Well, for me, the charge or the given of making space for art is that you're trying to tune a void, to either receive a collection, amplify a collection that you know, or inspire work that you don't know, right? And you're crafting this void. And the Still Museum was such a response to the site and the kind of verbosity of the Liebskin and a lot of the other surrounding buildings. And so that, bringing the building to the ground, anchoring it with concrete, creating this sanctuary for this work, and then opening it up with light. So I flew through, this is what you're referring to, and I saw it empty and I was heartbroken because it was too much about the architecture. The scale didn't feel right. Nothing felt right. I was devastated. It was awful. I went back and talked to the staff. And then, a month later at the opening, it just snapped into place with the art. Literally, like, it all made sense. And I know that sounds kind of silly and obvious in some way, but I think what people respond to in that building is how the building and the art and the light are just one thing.
Yeah, you can't talk about this building without talking about light. And there's this almost liquid light there. It makes me think of all these other incredible spaces when it comes to light. You have like the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris, or Louis Kahn's Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, the Rothko Chapel in Houston, Tadao Ando's Church of Light, or the Chichu Museum in Naoshima. I mean, sorry, Tom Wolfe, but if there's a religion, then I'm all in on this one.
Yeah, I was just so excited. You know, those paintings are so powerful and the color is so critical. And I just said, I didn't give the director a choice. I just said, we have to put these in natural light. And luckily, the technology exists for light control. I mean, again, it was the exact right moment in history where we could really do that and still protect. You know, half of his paintings have bare canvas or almost bare canvas. And so
there's also a time capsule-like element to this building. What's your take on time in relation to the Clyfford Still Museum?
Well, you have to be more specific than that. What's my take on time? I want to make you work harder for that one.
The archive.
Oh, that
the notion of it is on the one hand a sort of memorial, but it's very much an active space.
Mm-hmm. I guess it is sort of a memorial. Just all things Clyfford Still. To me, I didn't think of it that way. I just thought of it as because of the scale of the building and the way we designed it, so you see into all the rooms almost simultaneously. You know, that way of being present in a space with the work, yet connected to the whole body of the building and the whole body of his life, right? It's just a kind of, and I think this is another thing people respond to, intense intimacy. I mean, how many times do we go to an art space and get to feel that intimately connected? You know, art spaces are so often just big open rooms, you know, and it relies on the skill of the preparators and the curators to kind of scale it to a show, right?
You sink into the paintings.
Yeah, you're just kind of there. I think that's a huge part of why people like that space. It's so rare to be that intimately connected. Somewhere in some writing on that, I spoke of it. The building basically stands you with the art. You stand with the art. It's just you and the painting. And you're in the whole body of the building. You're just in the presence of his mind and his intent. Yeah, that's a gift. Yeah.
Back to the speed round.
Not so speedy.
Let's do this one in 25 seconds.
Okay, all right. We'll get speedier on this one.
11 Madison Park.
11 Madison Park. The chance to work in that gorgeous room, which I had known forever, courted my wife in that room, and then to work with two people at the time who were at the top, just gifted. Will Gadara in the front of the house and Daniel Hume in the back of the house, you know, to work with them. I mean, people who were, I've had, you know, Dan Wyden, I think I would categorize as a genius in his field. I think that's not surprising, right? And I've worked with others, but to work with the two of them, I think, who are geniuses in their own practices at the time when they were at the top of their field, was a gift. And then I got to design plates, tableware. I got to design the rooms for Daniel's food, which
I think time's up.
All right.
Sorry. We got to keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good.
The National Music Centre of Canada.
I was just there this weekend. It's a landscape piece. It is a landscape. It's landscape scaled. I mean, because it was a building that kind of manifested the history and aspirations of music as an art form, you know, for a nation, monumentality, we talked about it. It's time, you know, to really make something that has the presence of a national aspiration. And we use the hoodoos in southern Alberta as the inspiration, the landforms.
Well, I feel like I have to mention this sort of very tired Gotha theory that architecture is frozen music, because I think it would be more accurate to just say that without the frozen part, because, I mean, we've been talking about it. Architecture isn't frozen. It's an active thing. How do you think about music in the context of your architecture? And I'm thinking here not just about this National Music Center project, but also your finalist entry into the Arvo Pärt Center in Estonia. There's also a sort of musical undertone to your finalist entry for the UK Holocaust Memorial. You even built a model for the National Music Center out of a trombone.
Right, a trombone. To me, it's all a series of vessels. I mean, I make empty rooms, right? That's what I do for a living, right? All of those projects are trying to find a potent vessel, whether it's for a painting or a piece of music. So yeah, it's not any kind of literal allusion or compositional reference or anything other than back to that, you're making a room for your ears and you're making a room for your eyes. And that's a different charge. There's no question about that. And the cool thing in the National Music Center, I'd just been to David Byrne's piece and met him, playing the building when it was down at one of the piers, right? I forget which building it was in. The old pier building, or the old ferry terminal building, sorry. Where he had hooked up an organ to all the steel members, and it was kind of amazing. And so in the National Music Center, we designed this little 250-seat performance space. And working with Josh Dax, a theater designer, performing space designer. And we just wanted the whole building to be filled with sound. So when the performance space slides open, the entire building, 6 stories,
becomes an instrument.
Thank you.
Okay, next. National Veterans Memorial and Museum in Columbus, Ohio.
That was very moving. Very, very moving. For me, a different subject, not the arts, right? But very, very, I'd been thinking about this idea of service, hadn't written about it yet, what one serves in one's life, right? And to me, from the very beginning, was what, these people are giving up their time, they're giving up their lives, their families to serve. No matter what you think of how they serve or where they serve or the political context of that service. I mean, those are all very important things, but to manifest something that memorializes or really elevates. I mean, if all these buildings are about amplifying and elevating some quality, it's really about amplifying and elevating the idea of service. And it was amazing. I got to meet Senator John Glenn before he passed away. And that was one of the things he spoke about. And he spoke about it so eloquently and so powerfully. And I'm not talking about the architecture at all, am I? And at the end, the opening of that museum really was one of the most moving experiences. I had generals come up and thank me because no one had done a building for the, servicemen, just the men and women who just do this, the common
And
soldier.
architecture is orientation. I mean, this building is a spiral. It's an earthwork coming out of the ground.
Right. And that
it's
was
basically a compass.
Right. And that, because the site was very undistinguished at the time, and we knew it would become a very important marker for Columbus there on the river and across the bridge, right? So that was the first act was a landscape. Well, the first act was to make a room in the sky, to create a processional, the spiral ramp up, and then this, what I call the sanctuary, where there could be all kinds of services, celebrations, where veterans and their families could come together in that room in the sky held by this building.
There is an otherworldly quality to this building. I mean, it's one of the most real rendering-like pieces of architecture. I mean, it almost looks like it doesn't look like it should exist on Earth.
I don't understand what that is. Actually, either. It's true, isn't it? I mean, there's so many ways to talk about that building because the structure of that building, they're essentially cantilevered cantilevered, I don't know, fragments of arches that are held in tension on the top. So one of the most difficult things to build, I don't know how we got that thing built. So again, back to the thing where if I think of how to hold up that processional and that sanctuary in the sky, to lift it up with these concrete arches that are falling outwards by nature and being held together by the sanctuary, and just to create a there with that structure. Yes, without question, one of the most difficult pieces of construction I've ever.
All right, last one. Let's keep this under 60 seconds.
60K.
The U.S. Embassy in Mozambique.
10 acres on the Indian Ocean, in a town or in a country that had just gotten over, 20 years of civil war. Understanding why we build embassies, which is,
Fraught
and multifaceted, and to try to develop a language that is of that place, and also back to the National Music Center conversation, communicates something about our nation and what we aspire to and hope for, and what we want people to feel when they see the building. And the goal was to make it transparent, even though with all the security concerns and all the other things, to not have it be cloistered and walled and bounded and make it blur and blend.
We did it
with the place.
It's great. I want to end on the notion of buildings as beautiful ruins. This is something you spoke about earlier this year during an online Cooper Union lecture and interview with Nader Tarani. And you said that the first act of building is the last act of building. I really love this idea so much. I would hope that more architects take heed to that idea. And I was hoping you could speak to it further, this idea of architecture across time, perhaps even as a ruin, still standing in some form long after humans have vanished from this planet.
Mm-hmm. And it's not about the romanticism of it. It's not about the holding its place in history, like the Baths of Karkala or something, or the Forum, or of other kind of iconic ruins. But it's about it still holds its presence. So you encounter this, you see it in the first marks on the page of charcoal when it's right. You see it when the structure rises from the ground. I mean, that's when we know if we found it or not, or we know what we found, right? Is when that structure rises. I mean, the Veterans Memorial was a perfect example of that. Before it was glazed and it stood, it was both a ruin and a construct at the same time, and it was kind of unbelievable that way. But it's the presence, it's the life, it's the extension of that presence through time, right? I think that's the thing that it kind of transcends time, because those presences are in our lives every day, and the buildings, if they can, they just capture it and hold it for us.
Brad, I think we'll end there. That was beautiful, and thank you for putting up with my speed round. Your portfolio of work really is special, and I wanted to be sure to touch on as much as we could.
Well, that was a fun test. So thanks. It was really a great conversation, as always.
Extra thanks to our Season 6 sponsor, L'École School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. A unique place for learning, L'École welcomes the general public to the world of jewelry through courses, conferences, exhibitions, videos, and book publications. You can find out more about L'École at www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. And thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of Time Sensitive on our website, timesensitive.fm, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can listen to our other podcasts at a distance by heading to atadistancepodcast.com. You can follow us on Instagram at slowdown.tv. And if you like our programs, please be sure to subscribe and leave comments. Our theme music was composed by Billy Martin. This episode was produced by Ramon Broza, Emily Zhang, and Johnny Simon.